It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. At 68, especially without David by my side, it felt completely foreign. For 4 decades we had shared everything. Our home, our dreams, and our love. He was my anchor, my confidant, and my greatest inspiration. However, after his passing 5 years ago, it seemed like all the color had drained from my world. In the aftermath of his death, I struggled to regain my balance. I immersed myself in my art, hoping to capture the vibrancy that once energized my life. Yet, with every stroke of the brush, I felt myself drifting further away from who I was. Eventually, I abandoned painting altogether, stowing away the easel, canvases, and paints that had once brought me so much joy. They had remained untouched for years. That's how I found myself in this serene retirement community tucked away in the hills. It truly was a lovely place. A sanctuary of well-kept gardens, winding stone paths, and quaint, elegant cottages. But now beauty felt like a distant memory, an echo of something just beyond my reach. My days were spent wandering through the gardens or sitting by the large windows of my cottage, gazing at the view that once offered me solace. It was only when I noticed James, the reserved groundskeeper tending to the community gardens, that I felt a flicker of life stir within me again. Initially, I paid him little attention. He was younger, probably in his mid-40s. Though he seemed kind, I wasn't seeking companionship. I told myself I was content to live out my days in solitude, surrounded by the memories of my past. As the weeks went by, I found myself observing him while he worked in the flower beds near my home. There was a tenderness in how he cared for the plants, as if he understood their needs and rhythms. He moved with quiet determination, his hands skillfully pulling weeds, planting new life and coaxing beauty from the earth. One afternoon, while sitting on my porch with a sketchpad in hand but lacking inspiration, he paused to wipe his brow. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment and I truly saw him, not just as a figure in the distance but as a real person. There was something in his gaze, a quiet strength that reminded me of someone I once knew. Maybe it was David, or perhaps it was merely a reflection of my own solitude. I didn't expect much from our first conversation. After all, he was just a gardener, and I was merely a widow navigating the autumn of my life. But that day marked a shift. We chatted about the flowers he was planting, roses, peonies, and some rare blooms I couldn't quite recall the names of. He spoke with such reverence for nature and the growth process that I found myself captivated by his words. From then on, I began to look for him during my walks. We exchanged friendly remarks, brief chats about the weather or the state of the gardens. Yet, I felt a connection developing that surprised me with its quiet intensity. I hadn't felt such a pull toward anyone in years, and it was unsettling. The first time I genuinely really noticed him, was on a cool afternoon in late spring. I had taken my usual stroll through the gardens that morning, relishing the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I spotted James bent over a patch of dahlias, his hands deep in the soil. There was something about his method of working that intrigued me, a calm, deliberate care I hadn't anticipated from someone who seemed, at first glance, merely a groundskeeper. I lingered by the rose bushes, watching him longer than I probably should have. His movements were steady and precise, revealing that he truly understood the earth in a way few people do. He wasn't just planting flowers, he was nurturing them, encouraging them to bloom just like one might coax a shy child to speak. It had been ages since I felt any spark or desire to connect with another person. After David's passing, I had retreated into my art, only to discover that even my paintings had lost their vibrancy. But standing there observing James at work, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in years. Was it curiosity, or perhaps something deeper? I approached him, unsure of what to say, when he looked up and smiled. It was a small, polite gesture, yet there was a warmth in his eyes that made me feel seen for the first time in ages. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding odd to my own ears. I had grown so accustomed to my own silence that speaking to someone else felt unfamiliar. "Good morning," he replied, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's a beautiful day for gardening, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, glancing at the flowers he had planted. "Those dahlias are lovely. My husband used to plant them in our garden. He had a way with flowers." "I can tell," James said, looking around at the surrounding blooms. "You have a beautiful garden." "It's not mine," I quickly interjected. I mean, I didn't plant it. It was here when I moved in. He nodded, not pressing further. But I could sense he understood the significance behind my words. The garden may have been beautiful, but it wasn't mine. It was a borrowed beauty, much like the life I had been leading since David's death. For several weeks, James and I continued our casual exchanges. With each conversation, I found myself lingering longer, paying closer attention to his voice and the stories he shared about his work with plants and his experiences living in different parts of the country. He possessed a kind of patience and steadiness that was rare among younger men. There was no rush in his speech, no need to fill every pause with chatter. I appreciated that more than I could articulate. He was nothing like David, who had been a talker, always filling our days with conversation and grand ambitions. James was different. He was quieter, more introspective. Yet there was something about his silence that drew me in, a depth in his eyes that hinted at experiences, perhaps even pain, that he never needed to vocalize. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch sketching the distant hills, I caught sight of James tending to the flower beds. He moved with a graceful efficiency, and I realized just how much I had come to enjoy his presence, even from a distance. It had been ages since I felt such comfort in another's company, particularly with a man. After David's death, I had sealed that part of my heart, convinced that love or companionship was no longer in the cards for me. Yet, as I watched James, I began to question that assumption. Then an unexpected storm changed everything. The day had been warm and sunny, but by late afternoon dark clouds rolled in over the hills, bringing a sudden gust of wind and the scent of impending rain. I was seated by the window, observing the storm gather, when I noticed James hurriedly collecting his tools from the garden. Without a second thought, I grabbed an umbrella and dashed outside. By the time I reached him, the rain was already beginning to fall in heavy drops, soaking my clothes. "You should come inside," I shouted over the howling wind. James looked up, surprised to see me there. He hesitated for a moment before nodding, grabbing the last of his tools and following me back to the porch. By the time we reached the door, we were both drenched. "Thank you," he said, shaking the rain from his hair as he stepped inside. "I didn't expect the storm to arrive so swiftly." "Neither did I," I replied, handing him a towel. "You should stay until it passes. It looks like it's going to be quite a storm." He nodded, gratefully accepting the towel as he dried off. I realized how strange it felt to have someone else in the house since David had passed. The cottage had been so quiet and still, but with James standing in the living room, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor, it felt alive again. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like something to drink?" "There. Coffee. Tea would be nice," he replied, his voice soft as I moved around the kitchen to prepare it. A tension began to build inside me, not an unpleasant one, but rather a sense of anticipation, a quiet excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The rain pounded against the windows, and the air in the house felt charged with the storm's energy. When I brought the tea to the living room, I found James standing by the window watching the rain. He turned as I approached, offering a small smile of thanks as he took the cup from my hands. "I don't usually come inside other people's homes," he said after a moment, his gaze returning to the storm outside. "I'm more comfortable out in the garden." "You spend so much time in the garden," I replied, settling onto the couch. "It must be nice to be so close to the earth." He nodded, his expression contemplative. "It's the only thing that makes sense to me sometimes when life feels chaotic. The garden has a rhythm that never changes. It's peaceful." I understood exactly what he meant. After David's death, I had found solace in the predictable routines of my daily life. Tea in the morning, a walk in the afternoon, and quiet evenings spent watching the sunset behind the hills. But that solace had gradually morphed into isolation. Sitting there with James, I realized just how much I had been missing for a long time. We sat in silence, listening to the rain. The storm had knocked out the power, and the only light in the room came from the flickering candles I had placed on the table. A warmth enveloped us, something unspoken yet deeply felt. I could sense the pull of his presence, the quiet strength of his company. It was clear that something had shifted between us. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Being around people?" James paused, his brow furrowing in thought. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I've grown accustomed to being alone. It's easier that way. I nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. I used to be surrounded by people, I said softly. My husband always brought artists, musicians, and dreamers into our lives. But after he died, all that vanished. I vanished. James turned to me, his expression softening. You haven't gone anywhere, Elaine. His words took me by surprise. I couldn't tell if it was the way he said my name or the sincerity in his voice, but for the first time in years I felt truly seen. Looking up at him, I realized that the distance I had felt for so long wasn't nearly as vast as I had imagined. I don't know if I can come back, I whispered, my voice trembling under the weight of my emotions. I don't even know if I know how. James stepped closer, his hand gently reaching out to touch my arm. You don't have to know how, he said softly. You just need to take the first step. I looked into his eyes, my heart racing in my chest. The air between us was thick with the tension of unspoken desire, of a connection that had quietly developed over the past few weeks. I felt it in the way he looked at me, in the warmth of his hand on my arm, and in how my own body responded to his presence. Without thinking, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, and in that instant the world seemed to fade away. There was no storm, no past, and no future. Only the quiet intensity of our bond remained as we separated. I felt breathless, my heart racing with a blend of excitement and apprehension. I had never anticipated feeling this way again, wanting someone after enduring so many years of solitude. But now, standing with James, I recognized that my earlier beliefs had been misguided. His gaze was filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. Elaine, I know, I interjected quickly, cutting him off before he could finish his thought. I know. Taking a step back, I was suddenly overwhelmed by the depth of my emotions. I need some time, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I need to process this. James nodded, understanding reflected in his eyes. Take as long as you need, he said gently. I'll be here. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding James. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because I was unsure how to confront what had just happened. The kiss had stirred feelings within me that I hadn't experienced in years, and that frightened me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could recall the warmth of his lips, the profound connection we had shared. It was more than mere desire. It was the prospect of something new and unknown, something I wasn't certain I was ready to embrace. Guilt weighed heavily on my heart. How could I allow myself to feel this way when David was still so present in my life? How could I even entertain the idea of moving on, of wanting someone else, while still carrying the memory of the love of my life? I started wandering through the gardens more frequently, hoping to clear my head. Yet, my thoughts remained consumed by James, the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel alive again. But with that exhilaration came a daunting fear. The fear of vulnerability, of opening myself up again, and the risk of losing someone else. One afternoon, while resting on a bench overlooking the rose garden, I found myself reflecting on David. He had always embraced life wholeheartedly, determined to savor every moment. He would have disapproved of how I had withdrawn into myself after his passing. He would have encouraged me to keep living and loving, even if it meant loving someone new. However, acknowledging that didn't ease my burden. The days crept by, each one heavy with uncertainty. I couldn't ignore the turmoil that had brewed within me since that fateful night. It was about more than just the kiss. It represented a significant shift. I had found comfort in my grief for so long that the thought of experiencing something new, something vibrant, felt both thrilling and terrifying. I kept my distance from the garden where James worked, fearful of the words I might say or the actions I might take if I saw him. Yet, his presence lingered in my mind. I had shared a connection with him that I hadn't experienced since David's death. A part of myself I thought I had lost forever. It was the part that craved companionship, that yearned for touch, intimacy, and something more than just the solitude of my own thoughts. But what if this was misguided? What if it was merely loneliness tricking my heart into believing this connection was genuine? I found myself wandering around my cottage, tracing my fingers over the framed photographs of David on the mantel, questioning whether he would understand my turmoil. In a moment of vulnerability, I decided to call my sister Lucy. She was the only one who had stood by me through every stage of my grief, The person who understood my heart almost as well as I did. Elaine. Lucy's familiar voice greeted me after just a few rings, warm and comforting. It's been a while. How are you holding up? I hesitated, unsure of how to express what I was feeling. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted quietly, my hand trembling slightly as I held the phone. I think I've crossed a line. Something I can't quite make sense of. Lucy didn't press me. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch until I was ready to continue. There's someone, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone who's made me feel things I haven't felt in ages. Lucy paused before responding. You don't need to feel ashamed of that, Elaine. It's been years since David passed. You're allowed to experience feelings again. I don't know if I can, I confessed, tears threatening to spill over. I feel like I'm betraying him. Like I'm betraying everything we built together. Elaine, you loved David, Lucy replied gently. And he loved you. But that doesn't mean your life has to come to a standstill. You still have so much left to experience. And I believe David would have wanted you to find happiness. Her words penetrated my heart slowly, like raindrops nourishing dry soil. I had always known that David would want me to continue living, to seek joy once more. Yet, knowing it and truly feeling it were two different realms. Could I genuinely allow myself to embrace someone new? Was it feasible to love again in a way that didn't diminish the love I had for David? I'm scared, I admitted, my voice quivering. I don't know if I'm ready. Only you can make that decision, Lucy said softly. But don't close yourself off due to fear. Life doesn't halt just because we've lost someone. You deserve to feel alive again, Elaine. After our conversation ended, I sat in the quiet of my cottage, contemplating Lucy's advice. I had spent far too long hiding behind my grief, using it as a barrier against the world. But perhaps it was time to lower that barrier. Maybe it was time to allow myself to be open to love again. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. For the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened by my past. With determination, I set out to find James as I walked through the gardens. My heart raced, a flurry of nerves swirling in my stomach. I had no idea what I would say, but I knew I had to confront him. I had to acknowledge what was happening between us. When I located James, he was tending to the rose garden, his hands immersed in the rich soil. He glanced up upon seeing me, and I could read the uncertainty in his eyes. The unspoken question of whether I had come to push him away or to welcome him back. Elaine, he said softly, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. I wasn't sure if I'd see you again. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, my voice quivering slightly. But I needed time to think. I had to figure out what all of this means. James nodded, his expression serious yet understanding. I didn't want to pressure you, he replied quietly. I never intended to make you feel obligated to do something you weren't ready for. I know, I said, taking a deep breath. But I've been reflecting a lot about us, and I realize I've hidden behind my grief for too long. I forgot what it feels like to truly live, to experience something genuine. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. And now, I replied, my voice steady. I think I'm ready to stop hiding. For a long moment we stood there, the weight of our unexpressed emotions suspended between us. Slowly, I reached out and took his hand, my fingers trembling as they brushed against his. I don't know what this is, I whispered. But I want to discover it. A small, tender smile spread across James's face, stirring something deep within my heart. So do I, he replied softly. We lingered there for a while, hand in hand, the late morning sun casting a warm glow over the garden. There was no rush, no urgency. Only a shared understanding that we were both stepping into uncharted territory, something that could transform our lives. Later that evening, I invited James back to my cottage. The power had returned, but I had kept the candles lit, their soft light filling the room with warmth that mirrored the emotions swirling in my chest. As we sat on the couch engaged in quiet conversation, I realized this was about more than mere attraction. This was a profound connection, an unspoken bond that had blossomed between us over the weeks, nurtured by our shared experiences and our mutual loneliness. Eventually, our conversation faded into comfortable silence. James reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was delicate, and I felt my heart race. This time, however, I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into his hand, allowing myself to absorb the warmth of his skin against mine. In that intimate moment, he whispered, "You're beautiful, Elaine." I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. It had been so long since I felt beautiful or wanted. But in that instant, with James beside me, I felt truly alive once more. Our lips met, and this time it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was a kiss filled with the promise of something new and real. As we embraced, I felt the last of my reservations dissolve. I had spent so many years guarding my heart, fearful of what it might mean to feel again. But now, wrapped in James's arms, I understood that love wasn't something to dread. It was something to welcome and cherish. That night, we shared more than just a kiss. We experienced a moment of true intimacy, one that transcended the physical. It was a meeting of souls, a recognition of the loneliness we had both carried for so long, and a promise that we no longer needed to shoulder it alone. In the weeks that followed, my thoughts shifted from dwelling on the past to contemplating the future. The guilt I had felt about moving on from David began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet acceptance that, as Lucy had said, life didn't stop with loss. It continued, often in unexpected ways and with unexpected people. James and I grew closer, but there was no rush to label our relationship. We spent our days walking through the gardens, discussing everything and nothing at all, finding joy in the simple act of being together. One afternoon, while sitting by the window and watching the sunset over the hills, I realized I had discovered something I hadn't known I was searching for. It wasn't just love. It was a sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where I was meant to be. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, I turned to James, a smile forming on my lips. "I think I'm ready," I said quietly. "Ready for what?" he asked softly. "To paint again," I replied. James grinned, taking my hand in his. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Together we walked to my old art studio, a place once filled with color and light that I hadn't stepped foot in since David's passing. But now, with James beside me, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I picked up a paintbrush, the familiar weight of it in my hand was comforting, and as the brush touched the canvas, a wave of emotion surged through me: joy, hope, love. This wasn't about recreating the past. It was about embracing the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. As I painted, I knew I wasn't just rediscovering my art. I was rediscovering myself.